On behalf of the Georgia Center for Nonprofits, hello and welcome to our program today on trends impacting your nonprofits. I am Emily Gantert, our Manager of Member Services, and with us today speaking to these trends is our CEO, Karen Beaver. What we're going to walk through today is just the start of our conversation on these trends. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, everybody. So great to see your beautiful faces out there, and thanks for joining us. We will get started now. So we're going to talk a little bit about the future of nonprofits, 2023 and beyond. And what we've tried to do here is think about these macro forces that are impacting the sector and your work. And so we're not going to get overly tactical here. We're going to stay kind of at, let's call it 5,000 feet, kind of looking out over the next 5 years, things that are if they're of grave importance right now. When we talk about the economy, we'll be talking about some things that are happening now. But a lot of these things we're looking over sort of a 3 to 5 year horizon, trying to give you a sense of how to prepare, how to think about these things, and how to formulate strategy related. So let's get at it. Today, we have 8 areas that we're going to be populating the hub with, but today we really only have time with an hour to talk about 6 of those in depth. So we've chosen the top 6. So I want to start with public trust. It's probably not something that y'all thought about as a trend particularly, but I'm starting with this because it really is woven throughout the rest of the trends. And you're going to see this kind of pop up again and again and again in terms of its influence on the way that our work is performed, public will, donors, all kinds of things. And so I want to kind of lead you through. This is a very large report, but I've kind of cherry-picked a couple of things that I want to pull out that'll help you understand why it's so important to understand this from a trend perspective. Public trust, as I said, is linked to public will, and it's declining for nonprofits. For over 20 years, Edelman Public Relations has asked Americans to indicate if they trust nonprofits to do what's right, using a 9-point scale, where 1 means that, hey, I don't trust you at all, and 9 means I trust you a great deal, right? And actually, this report started 20 years ago for the nonprofit sector. It has then expanded to business, government, and the media. So it's interesting to see how all of those 4 kind of industries, if you will, relate to one another in terms of the public trust and how they are intertwined. This report, as I said, is comparative, and that's what makes it interesting. So in 2017, if we were to look at, does the public trust nonprofits? In 2017, we scored a 58. That's very, very healthy. That's not a neutral score. But right now in 2023, we're at a 50. That is a neutral score. We would much rather be higher on the rating scale. And this is what it looks like comparatively. I did not, as you'll see, sort of continually go back to all the previous reports and pull media and government. We have that information on the hub, but let's just suffice it to say, the public does not trust media and the government. So it's always low, a lot lower than nonprofits and business. But nonprofits and business, as you can tell, are sort of neck and neck in this, but we have seen kind of steady declines, let's call it, over the past 3 years. And I wanted to talk a little bit about why that might be. So let's first talk about the forces in 2023 that lead to polarization. It's interesting to go back to these reports. They're all public. You can see how these things kind of change over time, what's driving trust declines. But right now, from a macro perspective, in terms of all industries, whether we're nonprofit, media, government, or business, economic anxieties, institutional imbalance, which means sort of like, is government more so influential or is business more influential than other sectors? So institutional imbalance, mass scale class divide, and then the battle for truth, sort of information integrity, right? So these things are driving polarization and mistrust across the US and actually globally. So let's look a little bit at why trust is declining for nonprofits. Nonprofits, let's start with the good news. Nonprofits are perceived as the most ethical institution, more than business, certainly more than government, certainly more than the media. We are the most ethical institution. And the underlying factors that drive that are that nonprofits are seen as aligned with a shared vision of how I see my future. Nonprofits are seen as pursuing what is the most fair pay, equal opportunity, shared power, information transparency, and equity, among other things. And nonprofits are perceived to be the most capable of coordinating across sectors to create positive change. Think about, we have a brand of collaboration, right? But the public's perception of sector effectiveness is driven by an opinion of lower capability to execute plans and strategies that get results. So I want you to hear that. Where we fall lower than business is on this capability score, and it drives a lower trust score for us. They do not trust that we are able to get results by executing plans and strategies. And you can see that here in these results. NGOs or nonprofits are seen as the most ethical, right? But business is seen as both ethical and competent. Business far outranks nonprofits when it comes to perceptions of ability to successfully execute plans and strategies that yield results. So if we were to work on something to increase the public trust in the nonprofit sector, it would be the perception of competence. I believe y'all are competent. We know how hard we work. We know all of that, but the public has a different perception of that. So what are our opportunities here? How do we change this? Well, the first is continue to double down on storytelling that aligns with values and a shared vision for the future, right? We don't want to go completely over here to the competency side and just forget to tell these stories of equity and inclusion and solution building and that type of thing. But our big opportunity here is collaborative action that builds trust. And it is, in fact, what I call our superpower, right? And there's a few factors that I wanted to call out here. The public is 4 times more likely to believe that initiatives will be successful when sectors work together. So when business and government work together, or nonprofits and government, or nonprofits and business, literally 4 times more likely to believe that initiatives will be successful. And nonprofits are the most highly ranked collaborators out of all the sectors. We're perceived as ethical and fair and aligned in our sense of a shared vision. We are intrinsically seen as the space for collaborative leadership. So this is a huge opportunity for us. We should harness this leadership power to bridge the trust divide between the public. So this is not only an opportunity, I feel it's a responsibility, because it is important that the public trust our government. So partnerships between nonprofits and government are very important to raising their trust levels for initiatives that are important to all of us, right? The third is that impact data can be a proxy for competence. In a world of really quick sound bites, nonprofits don't really have a reliable way of articulating competence, as do business. They use stock price, or government uses GDP. There's a lot more to it, but those are 2 quick kind of examples. So narratives about our overall competence are kind of perpetuated by the association of the public's association between, hey, this issue really needs your support, right? And they begin to believe that nonprofits themselves are less than competent and need support, i.e. we're, doing our work with like carefully repaired rubber bands and cast off hotel pencils, right? When that couldn't be further from the truth, right? Nonprofits are 10% of US private employment. We hold incalculable assets. If you think about all the buildings and the art and everything else that we hold in trust, and we contribute to economic and social well-being. So we need to start to claim what that data means in terms of our industry's importance in policymaking and creating solutions and local economic development, for example. And the way that we articulate our competence to the public is very important. So we have a few really prime examples of opportunities here using some of the findings from Edelman Public Relations Trust Barometer. So let's look at some philanthropic trends, some things around foundations, corporations, and individuals. So let's look at these. The first thing I want to note, I'm not going to go through all 12 of these items here, and you're going to get this presentation later so you can look at this more deeply. But foundations internally are shifting and it mirrors some of what nonprofits are experiencing. So if you think about capacity, a lot of nonprofits don't have a lot of staff, right? And they are looking at the same kind of generational transition that nonprofits are looking at. And so they're restructuring internally to think about how to use their staff as impact multipliers, not cost drivers. They're thinking about, like, does size really mean that I'm making a big impact, or are there other things that I can look at here? Structure, in terms of their internal structure and unlocking new sources of value. They're thinking about different types of giving. PRIs are not common in the South. They are more common in the West. And that just basically means instead of straight grant making, they can actually use the lion's share of their money, which is their assets held on their balance sheet, to invest in different mission related activities. Right. And so they're looking at things of that nature, not every foundation, but some. They're thinking about how to orient towards frontline impact. They're looking at their own talent development down here. They're thinking about values and diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're thinking about leadership development and new leader development. And they're thinking about their own cultures. And number 12, I think, is one of the most important ones: mirroring internally what is sought externally. Changing their board composition, for example, is a great example of that. But we're going to talk in terms of just key giving trends, sort of some, three things that I think are kind of driving foundations right now. And some of these are taken from Philanthropy Southeast's recent survey and report on foundation giving trends, some of the biggest trends that are impacting the foundation world across the South. And I would say, without a doubt, the first is equity. And I think we will see this as a sustained trend over the next, foreseeable future. And just to kind of bring that home, in their report, 82% of their members, which is comprised of everything from community foundations, independent family foundations, corporate, health legacy foundations, they are prioritizing DEI, 82% of their members. And evidence of this change is seen because 50% of their members that were surveyed state that they have started focusing on equity since 2020, while a third note that they have had an existing focus over time. So it's not just sort of this static 82%. This is a growing, accelerating trend, which is much welcomed. They are doing this in several ways, integrating DEI into grant making standards. So if you filled out a grant application lately, you know that they're asking for a lot of demographic information that they perhaps previously have not. Widening the pipeline for new applicants, we're seeing retooled applications that are simplified, or two-tiered application processes where the first, not really a letter of intent, but the first application is just the basics. And then if you kind of get through that gateway, then there's a deeper application. Some foundations are even offering capacity workshops and even specific capacity preparation for local grant applications. So we're seeing that as a trend. They are reconstituting their own boards and staff, as I mentioned, and exploring trust-based philanthropy, where they're trending towards more flexible funding, but also engagement of their grantees and even their grantee stakeholders in the design of their approaches. And so a lot of this is happening now, and we're going to see further developments as we move along. We have some opportunities as nonprofits in relation to this. And I'm just going to kind of harp on the first one. You'll get these slides and you can read through the details of all of this. But nonprofits, I think, have a great opportunity right now to help inform philanthropic strategy. For many foundations, you saw that statistic, 50% are newly focused on this since 2020. They are broadly open to learning. And we have the opportunity to proactively lead initiatives that enable cooperative knowledge sharing about what we've learned relative to our own equity initiatives, strategies, and the needs that we have in order to pursue this in a more broad and deeper fashion. we need to really dig into impact measurement because they're hungry for that. Does this approach work? Does this approach work? If we did this, would it mean that? They are interested in building the capacity of nonprofits. And we have really a golden opportunity to talk about what is working and what is not working so that we can move on from what is kind of legacy not working. And then I think we have another very important opportunity, which is we are a channel to the end user, right? So we can help formulate foundation strategy better by putting what I call the customer, the stakeholder at the center of those conversations, bringing them into design conversations, helping foundations hear their voice in this work. From a systems perspective, I would say you've got two tiers here. Large national foundations are really more so focused, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but on systems work, and local foundations are a little bit more focused on functional kinds of areas like, getting your governance diverse, or what is the percentage of my grant making to this versus that, or am I aligned with the trends in my local area? And so that's not, again, a hard and fast rule, but it's what we are particularly seeing. So we can think about a little bit more collaborative or collective impact like models for addressing systemic barriers to equity goals. In terms of national funders, we're all relatively small. We've got some sort of national groups in Atlanta, but coalitions of groups leading a collective impact and having channels for funding to enter our area is really the opportunity there. The second is place-based philanthropy. We all, I think, probably know what this means, really sort of like localizing and doubling down dollars and influence and policy making and economic development into a particular area. What we see is that foundations seem to be pursuing this with somewhat of a renewed vigor, and it's tied into issues around equity and lack of equity in particular geographic areas. And I think the strategy is very, very compelling because it incorporates public-private partnerships, sort of visible change. If you think about the West Side and the development of the stadium and all of the businesses around there and the housing and et cetera, story, sort of how do we get that out into the public and sort of articulate that visible change? It incorporates equity, collaboration, dollar leverage. It's a very powerful mix of motivators that create a compelling investment story. And I think we're going to see more and more and more of that, particularly in response to some of the economic issues that are going on right now. So we can, in terms of opportunities, join current efforts or, kind of fill gaps in local strategies. The replication of successful models in local communities, I think, is a great opportunity to kind of start conversations about how to launch these kinds of place-based strategies in different areas across the state, particularly where there are new economic entrants, i.e. like EV battery companies and things like that have a stake in affordable housing and things of that nature. We can keep abreast of what I like to say, where the energy is flowing, right? So if we've got a lack of affordable housing, which is, completely the topic of the day, and it is thwarting efforts to lure business, that is a project that requires not just housing groups, but a lot of groups to come to the table and to catalyze solutions. And then, making the case to attach to local strategies where they're ongoing. For example, literacy programs can make the case that they're integral to workforce development strategies. You don't have to be on the external. We saw that a lot during COVID, where mental health came in, and it became really kind of a center point, not an adjacent component to strategy for dealing with COVID. So think about where you can attach. And then thirdly, economic turmoil and impacts to foundations. The economy affects foundations just, not exactly the same as nonprofits, but very similarly. They have investments that are impacted depending on what their investment policies are. And there's also, we need to remember, although we want COVID to kind of be far in the rearview mirror and kind of move on, but many foundations gave more during COVID and the immediate aftermath of racial justice turmoil. And this is unlikely to continue. And there's sort of a recalibration going on right now in terms of averaging out giving. And so they were giving more. It doesn't necessarily mean they will give dramatically less, but there is a sense of recalibration going on. And then thirdly, I wanted to mention that DAFs continue to expand. That's donor advised funds. And so not just at community foundations, but the top 6 recipients of dollars in terms of giving in the United States of America were big donor advised funds like Fidelity, for example. And so not individuals are certainly compelled to use DAFs because of tax incentives, but more and more foundations are actually using DAFs for flexibility and efficiency. And during COVID, it was found that DAFs could be a counterbalance to asset impact. So whereas maybe it's the economy is impacting our foundation's budget, we have this donor advised fund over here that has been growing sort of in the wings, and we can have more flexibility, about the subject matter in which through which we use those funds, but 2, we can give more out of this pool of funding that we have over here. You know, there's a downside to DAFs, which they lack transparency and it makes it a little bit more difficult to fundraise, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. But these are some of the trends that we see going on. And of course, we're in, it feels like every week we're in a new economy or economic situation. So this will be very fluid, and we'll continue to update the hub as we go. But nonprofits should know that foundations learned a lot during COVID about flexible funding. The industry name for this is sort of trust-based philanthropy, and it includes an openness to operating funding, co-design, constituent-centered approaches, as we talked about. And we should continue as an industry to press for more of this type of funding approach with more flexibility. Nonprofits should make it a priority to learn more about how DAFs function from a tax perspective, from a regulatory perspective, and how they can build strategies to tap into this vast and growing pool of resources. It is the most massively growing area of philanthropy right now. And in our point of view, nonprofits should advocate for greater transparency related to DAFs in general, and potentially some change in distribution requirements. At the present time, when funds are allocated to a donor advised fund, there is no requirement to distribute them. So they can be held into perpetuity at this point. So there's a lot of debate going on nationally about that. And then I think an opportunity for us is to be more economically minded, understand and plan for economic cycles and potential impacts, including how they impact various funding types. So corporate giving, it's a very interesting area right now because back to our trust barometer, business is in fact the most trusted entity, and more employees and the public are demanding that companies take on more of a purpose aspect to their work. So we're going to get into that. The second is the issues of the day are the issues of the decade, DEI and climate. And then 3, large companies are increasingly looking for more efficiency, and that is coloring the way that they actually are allocating and giving dollars using technology. And then 4, again, flexibility, but in terms of how they are engaging employees in giving and volunteering. So let's look at some of these. As I said, this is from the Edelman Trust Barometer. Look at these numbers. 63% I buy or advocate for brands based on my beliefs and values. And then let's look over here at employees. 69% having a societal impact is a strong expectation or deal breaker when considering a job. Companies understand this. CSR professionals are at the center point of this, managing this. And so they're really thinking about, on the one hand, how do I harness this level of trust? How do we create opportunities to retain our employees, to retain our customers, to build our brand? But how do we not alienate both of these audiences by getting overly political, for example, or being attaching to politics in some kind of detrimental way? But you can imagine that taking a certain stance on everything from could be gender issues or climate issues or whatever, is polarizing, right? In a already very polarized world. And so they've got a very interesting dance to dance at this point. And so let's look at purpose and work. Here's the stats. 70% of employees demand social responsibility. 93% believe that organizations must lead with purpose, organizations being businesses. 55% of employees say they would rather work for a socially responsible organization, even if it meant having a lower income. And 71% of employees claim it's imperative that they work for a company where culture is supportive of volunteering and giving. These are driving some of the strategies within CSR. And certainly a lot of what you're seeing coming out of CSR has to do with talent, retention, talent acquisition in certain areas, and certainly their brand, their employment brand. The issues of the decade: equity and climate. Equity and climate. These are things that you are seeing. Their ESG reports are in their investor relations reports really are driving a lot of internal work on everything from suppliers to their own marketing messages to the way that they, build plants. I mean, it's all over the place. Equity, front, backwards, sideways. They are very focused on this. The future workforce demands it, and their success in the future demands it. Their consumers are demanding it. And so they're very, very focused. These two things are driving giving. They're driving CSR investments within companies. Efficiency is a big bucket. There are a lot of things under this, but what we're seeing here is a narrowing of focus, particularly in very large national companies. And this is really about efficiency. Imagine if you're taking in thousands of proposals and you're approving thousands of smaller proposals. You've got to administer that. You've got to get the reports. You've got to aggregate those reports. You've got to have customer service. There's a lot to do administratively. So more money to fewer organizations that can cover a broader waterfront equals less administration. They are trying to formulate tighter alignment with consumer and employee motivations, as we just kind of talked about, and a more efficient, sort of focused modality helps with that. Place-based participation, again, it's very compelling. It leverages their money, their skills, their time, their influence. It creates coalitions, sort of partnerships with government and suppliers, and has a PR effect, bringing their brand into that. And coalitions also help with their systems impact work, which we know that they're very interested in from a strategy perspective. Technology is driving transparency into their work, but also your work. They're required to do certain kinds of reporting on how they're using energy. There's lots of ESG goals, and their investors are demanding this. And then they're tracking their investment ROI, the numbers of things produced, the cost of those things. With technology is becoming easier and easier. And so you're going to see a lot of that moving across. And then finally, flexibility. CSR, less command and control, like we're going to do these big volunteer days. I'm not saying that they're not, but it's more strategy oriented at this point. CSR is really at the center point of a lot of strategy within the company, not peripheral anymore. And so, a lot of what's happening is positioning good as almost an employee benefit. You have these matching funds, you have these volunteer days, et cetera. So we talked about that with talent. Hybrid workforce, sort of evolving corporate volunteerism is more self-defined and less kind of all hands on days. It's hard to get your entire employee base out for a big, food sort. So they're saying, do good and let us know what you did. And then growth of matching funds across not just the big companies now, but it is one of the fastest growing areas of mid-sized companies. And then peer-driven initiatives are definitely on the rise. The number one opportunity for nonprofits across, it doesn't matter whether you're in a rural area or in an urban area, is really matching funds. And let's talk about that. 39% of companies surveyed indicate plans to expand their workplace giving programs in the next 2 years. And in the last 3 years, the percentage of Russell 1000 companies that offer corporate matching gifts grew by almost 12%. So let's look at those numbers. 67% of Fortune 500 offer matching gift programs, and that's also been growing. And then you're pairing that up with these smaller companies. 27 million individuals work for companies that offer matching gift programs, and 78% of those individuals are unaware of that matching gift program. So we, as a nonprofit sector, are leaving roughly about 4 to 7 billion on the table every year. That is a huge opportunity to focus and think about how you use things like, Georgia Gives or on Giving Tuesday or crowdfunding, or thinking about, just penetrating that corporate giver to access those matching funds. And that kind of bleeds into individual giving trends. So one of the biggest trends going on in the sector right now is that individual donor numbers are decreasing, even though donation totals are up. In 2000, about 2/3 of American households gave, and it's in 2018, kind of under half of American households did. That's about 20 million Americans that have literally stopped giving cash. Now, we're not looking at volunteerism and other kinds of in-kind. We're looking at cash. Individual giving as a percentage of all giving categories for the first time has placed under 70% for the third year in a row. Let's look at some of the underlying factors in that. In 2022, donors, that was the end of 2022, so as of December, donors who gave less than $100 decreased by 17%. Donors giving between 100 and 500, those mid-size, are decreased 8.4%. But we did not see any kind of decrease in those that were giving more than 50,000. So therein lies the story, kind of what's going on. Well, it's sort of a few things. The big three are that religious giving has historically dominated, and people aren't going to church as much more. They're not affiliated with church, synagogue, etc. 29% of Americans have no religious affiliation. So because it is the largest category and it is declining the total individual giving numbers. The economy, obviously, steady decline since the Great Recession, and it is responsible for 1/3 of the persistent donor loss. And then I would say, thirdly, the spotlight has been really fixed on wealthy mega donors like Mackenzie Scott and things like that. While the contributions of smaller donors are sort of diminished, they're almost invisible. We're not really talking about that. It's all in the media about these big donors. The rise of donor advised funds is increasing the amounts from a smaller relative number of donors, so big amounts to donor advised funds. And then people, believe it or not, think of charitable and political giving interchangeably. If they give to politics, they feel like they've given. And this was a huge study by the Lilly School of Philanthropy, thousands of responses. Trust declines are part of this. And then there's different ways to give, right? You can do a GoFundMe kind of donation that goes directly to an individual, so you don't have to go through an intermediary. And in fact, this is a big trend. 57% of Gen Z believe that giving directly has more impact than giving to nonprofits. So that is something we're going to see upcoming. So, just going back to trust, I just want to kind of hone in on this. We have issues related to economic fears in giving, right? So where this green arrow is, this is the US. We are way in the negative territory. My family and I will be better off. People are fearful, economically fearful. They have existential fears, right? It's not just personal economic fears, which you can see over here on the left. They really are concerned with climate change and war and food shortages and energy shortages. People are just worried in general, right? And they're distracted, and it really stops people from thinking they can give comfortably. And then here's the one that I think is the most interesting. There is a massive class divide. There's a chasm of trust between socioeconomic levels. So over here, we have high income folks, and they're at 63, way in the trust zone, right? They trust. But people down here in the low income area don't trust at all. They're at a 40, way in the negative territory, right? And so there is a chasm, and that's where you're seeing these smaller donors and mid-sized donors fall off. They don't trust as much. They don't believe that things are getting better and that institutions are doing their job. There are a lot of issues related to this. Consolidation into fewer wealthy hands is not the best thing in terms of influence. Donor advised funds and the growth of those. There are lots of tax benefits that make them very appealing again, and they don't have to distribute funds. So we have got a great enormous pools of money just sitting and not necessarily hitting the sector. And then, and I give you an example here of the Zuckerbergs. And there's little transparency and very difficult for fundraisers because you can't really form relationships with DAFs and you can't figure out who the donors are. And so there's a lot going on there with DAFs. And then again, seismic demographic shifts. So lots of opportunities here, making giving easy through technology, microsites focused on crowdfunding to engage Gen Zers, considering new ways to connect to and appreciate small donors. Don't leave your matching gifts on the table with your companies, and there's platforms for that, and learning opportunities related to public trust. HR trends, kind of baselining HR trends with talent. This is the primary reasons for voluntary turnover in nonprofit organizations, not in companies. And so this was a massive sort of HR study, and you can see sort of upward mobility is a factor, better opportunities, comp and benefits is definitely in there, but you're also looking at kind of lack of professional development down here, lots of things of that nature. So let's kind of get into it. 3 trends: human-centric work, worker, and workspace. The new nonprofit workforce wants to feel connected and aligned with their organization, leaders, and work. They want personalized career development pathways. They are very interested in learning and upskilling opportunities, upward mobility, different kinds of opportunities to learn, tools that enhance their productivity and engagement. Technology is just massively important. And then competitive pay, fairness, equity, competitive pay, health, wellness benefits. You know, for the sector, I think a historic underinvestment in talent, culture, and HR processes. Thinking about our people as overhead has not served us well, and it is definitely coming home to roost. And it's something we need to talk to our investors about, our foundations and investors. Empowering the workspace is the next trend, just rethinking digital, how we actually serve our clients digitally if we can. Hybrid work, obviously we beat that to death, but it will be the norm. We do understand that many nonprofits do not have the ability to have hybrid, or they have less than flexible work, and they will need to manage these expectations and culture more closely and think a lot more creatively about how to differentiate from competitors, maybe with creative scheduling or considering how to transition certain functions to digital service, and certainly the use of technology across the board to heighten workers' capabilities and kind of unleash their full potential. All of these are very important to enabling the workspace. And then retention, there's a recipe: culture, equity, well-being for the sector, prioritizing employee engagement and culture. And nonprofits in particular are doing this by thinking about performance management and how to train that into their managers and their leaders, prioritizing kind of total rewards rather than just compensation, thinking about all the benefits they're able to offer, focusing on learning development. That is a huge trend, and upskilling and providing those opportunities. And then really thinking about how their supervisors and managers do that work. And so we know that people leave primarily because of bad management. And then diversity, equity, inclusion, just really doubling down on DEI inside organizations, not just talking about it, but thinking about it from a strategy perspective and a capability perspective. And then employee health and well-being, more and more important than ever, to make sure your folks are mentally and physically well. So we've got a few opportunities, what I call resignation rebounding. There are folks that left the sector, left work in general, and they're like, oh, the economy is not so great, and they're rebounding back. So it's important to kind of keep up with your past employees and maybe reach out to them. boomers, retired boomers, as kind of PRN, which is sort of like temp workers, and what I call project launchers. They have a lot of skills, they could come in and launch something. They might not want to work full time and then hand it off to somebody that's going to manage that long term. Outsourcing will grow, strengthening employer brands will grow, learning and development as a key to retention is growing. And then I just think empowering new leaders and leadership styles with, insights and skills and methods, particularly around DEI and employee wellness is really important. And then considering how work impact is accomplished, what can you digitize? What can you do for your clients that you've always done kind of in person that you might be able to do differently? Volunteering is kind of over the past 3 years, it declined obviously during COVID. It's sort of evened out, but still lower than pre-pandemic years. If we were to go before 2002, you would have seen this much higher, but it's really the hours that folks are volunteering right now that is problematic. And so what we're seeing is a lot more short-term kind of volunteering, not that recurring, I'm coming back every week and sorting food kind of thing going on. And so it's really episodic, and the hours are the problem mainly. So this is a problem because obviously volunteering is a way to get work done, and it also is an engagement point for current and future donors. And so in both these ways, it's extremely important to the sector. So, volunteer trends, shorter term engagements, time, processes, they just do not want to look around for your hours or where your volunteer opportunities are. And so they really want better processes when they get there through technology, checking in and et cetera, and then just an easier way to find opportunities. And then there's this Gen mix relevance. So you've got boomers on the one hand, Gen Z on the other, coming in to volunteer. What have you got for them both to do? And think about your projects in that kind of way. So hybrid projects are important. And I would say this number 6 is really interesting as a trend, experience driven. People are looking for unique, social, fun, but purpose-driven, i.e. meaningful ways to volunteer. And so it's just like, it's almost like you have to do food sorting with craft cocktails at this point. I mean, it's just, you've got to really think about what makes this unique and sticky and experience-driven for volunteers, and particularly those that are recurring, if you want them recurring. And then there's an evolving corporate scene, like I said, during the corporate funding component. Downsized and hybrid work-heavy corporations are somewhat trending away from formal all-hands days, not necessarily volunteerism, but highly managed volunteer efforts are very sort of internally costly. And they're really kind of trending towards simple encouragement and grappling with the tracking and all of the things around that. Now, we'll see if that changes and if that holds. But, there's several opportunities. The biggest one right now, I think, is creating experiences, but also kind of leveraging an inspired public coming out of COVID. 73% of Americans believe volunteering is going to be more important than ever. And so they've got that mindset. We need to find ways to leverage that mindset. Technology and data, a lot of trends, but following the Oscars, digital everything everywhere all at once, right? So we're talking cloud-based systems, automation, hybrid events, there's cybersecurity issues, lots of new technologies like AI coming. Technology really drives talent. I'm not going to belabor this, but your talent will not work for you if you do not have good technology that is leveraging their time and their talent. These are current statistics for that. I would say let's nod to AI, jobs that AI is already doing in the nonprofit sector, content marketing, hiring assessment, generating reports, doing financial analysis. It's really coming on strong. Whether you use it or not, it is happening. And I think some of the biggest opportunities here around the marketing and social media area. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on was kind of transparency. The triangulation of data is here. And there is the ability right now at the touch of a button to pull reports that aggregate your 990s over a number of years, look at trends, the ability to find, filter, and analyze current need data by the neighborhood level is at every donor's fingertips. It's at your fingertips. And then the ability for them to triangulate all this and benchmark your success data from your peer success data is at our fingertips now, and AI will only elevate this. And so all of this data that's sort of hanging out in the universe is actually able to come together in insight building reports. It doesn't necessarily need to be ominous. Transparency actually enhances trust, and you will have through AI maybe the capability to reach new audiences because it more particularly targets and allows you to have kind of like almost marketing assistance, and then it certainly will drive retention. And then we have the economy. Lastly, there's a lot of turmoil. What I really want you to know is that nonprofits are very important to Georgia's economy. So when we're talking about the economy impact on your business, let's talk about our business's impact on the economy for a minute. We have 3 of the most dominant and top 20 industries in the state of Georgia. So like I checkmarked here, healthcare and social assistance is huge. It's, what is that? The number 7 largest industry by gross state product. That means that's attention getting, right? We also have the 16th and the 18th. In terms of jobs, we employ almost 458,000 people. It's 9.4% of the total people employed in the state of Georgia. It's the 4th overall largest job creator in the state. And our jobs are growing. Our jobs grew throughout COVID, and they're still growing now. They provide $23 billion in total compensation that we spend on everything from gas to whatever. So we are a very important industry. And secondly, I think it's important for us to understand what's driving Georgia's economy. Humans create demand. There's new industries that are popping up, particularly the battery, sort of they call it energy mobility, but it's basically EV batteries and batteries that will power the economy. And then we have declining industries. And certainly as the economy affects things like real estate and construction, those are huge employers in our state, and that means increased demand from their folks that they're laying off and need help. And there's a lot of opportunity there in terms of partnerships to attract donors, but also policy collaboration. So we've included some commentary on headwinds, including interest rates and how they particularly affect nonprofits in terms of our own costs. And I would just point out how many nonprofits get government funding and how much of that is reimbursable. And when we have to bridge fund that work through loans or credit cards or lines of credit, those are often variable rates, and interest rates hurt us as a sector. Certainly rising costs and lots of employee issues related. And then hybrid work, but also recession. But what we want to say is Georgia actually does have one of the stronger economies. And while the Selig Center at UGA does place odds very high that we might have a mild recession, ours in the state will tend to be less than others. And that is a December kind of outlook the Selig Center puts together. So I thought it was worth mentioning.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen. Folks who are joining us, we are going to stay on, as Karen mentioned, and get to as many of these questions as we can. So are there groups that are advocating for transparency and reform that we talked about with those donor advised funds? And if so, what are the entry points for nonprofit executives and leaders?
Right. It's definitely something that Georgia Center for Nonprofits is working on. And we often work on that's obviously a federal tax issue, right? And so we have leading entities like Independent Sector, for example, that are kind of leading the charge, and we're sort of collaborating with them as the Georgia's representatives. But you could definitely plug into Independent Sector. Some of even the council foundations, for example, has this as a topic area. So it's not necessarily relegated. The concern is not necessarily relegated to nonprofits. Certainly the foundation community also understands the pros and the cons of it and is aware of that. But I do believe that in our point of view, in the center's point of view, it is up to nonprofits to press on this as a coalition. And you do that by, part of your membership in GCN sort of allows us to do this type of policy and advocacy work on a federal level, but also a state level.
Excellent. So we talked about sources of funding, donor advised funds, other things like that. What are some resources, or do you have any recommendations for where people can go to learn more about those opportunities? Matching gifts was one that came up, and then the donor advised funds.
I
as
do.
well.
And when we send out these slides, we'll have some deeper dig kind of resources. And there's some particular resources that you can use to learn a lot more about donor advised funds. Just being aware of those, they're just the fastest growing area in philanthropy right now. It's just huge bucketfuls of money just flowing into donor advised funds. It's because of the tax incentives, right? And so you can learn a little bit more about how that happens, and then maybe some tactics around tapping into those. But I would say, it's hard, right? We're all grappling with that right now because the transparency just isn't there. If you think about a community foundation, for example, and I'm not ragging on community foundations at all, believe in them. And in fact, their donor advised funds are activated more so than just sort of like the Fidelities and et cetera, because they try to have relationships with their donors and get them to activate them, right? So we are for community foundations, but when a donor gives money into a donor advised fund, it becomes community foundation dollars, right? And so their name is not necessarily on it externally, right? So those gifts just sort of happen from the community foundation. They just sort of happen. You will see that on many nonprofit 990s, or where you just see donation from Fidelity. It's not necessarily XYZ person, right? It's Fidelity. So I hope that helps a little bit.
And I will add to that in terms of grants. If you're not signed up for the GCN funding newsletter, I think that's a first stop shop for that avenue as well. Okay, we touched briefly on AI. This is not necessarily new, but it is quickly evolving technology in the last few months here. Are there any that are going after the nonprofit sector? Are there any being designed that we've heard of with those needs in mind?
There are a lot of new startups that are definitely using AI for kind of funding research, or I talked about data triangulation, sort of like, bringing lots of disparate data into kind of one view. So AI is very good at taking a lot of data and establishing patterns from it, right? Whether that's financial data, or whether that's your stakeholder data, or whether that's data about, your organization. It's very good at doing that. I would say some of the most, kind of prevalent in the media kind of uses of that are around sort of marketing content or social media content. I mean, it literally will, kind of write headlines for you, give you like sort of like 4 options, and you can kind of tweak and develop those. But they also kind of look at the search algorithms and can tell you which ones are going to perform better. And that's kind of the difference there. And so I think, we really kind of see this kind of take off in a lot of different ways, but there are a lot of startups that are for nonprofits utilizing AI right now, for sure.
Excellent. So speaking of data, that was an easy pivot there. Resources, where should nonprofits be going, or leaders be going, to keep an eye on data trends, especially in the state of Georgia, that are going to not just be statewide, but maybe allow them to drill in further to look at the areas that they serve by county, by city, something like that?
There again are really great systems right now. One is called Policy Map. Another locally is called Neighborhood Nexus, that actually uses some Policy Map data. And I love Neighborhood Nexus. They are taking streaming data. So think about like the Department of Education, different nonprofit even data into like child welfare sort of or education data. And they're streaming it in, and they're streaming it into the zip code level, neighborhood level, and then it is visualized, right? Like heat maps and location maps and things of that nature. And so there's a lot you can do with that. And it's not just singular components of data, but you can overlay. So if I was going to like be looking at hunger, I could go to something like Neighborhood Nexus or a Policy Map, for example, and I could put in, show me where there are a prevalence of use of food stamps, school lunch, and not a lot of grocery stores. And it would overlay those 3 data sources and show me where hunger was likely to be most prevalent by the neighborhood level. Literally, you can go down that far. And so those are a couple of the places that I would go to for that kind of data information and polls. And it's really like very fast. You would not believe it.
amazing how far we've come. All right, we do have a raised hand here. So Simeon, I want to go ahead and invite you if you want to unmute and let us know your question.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So my question was, I was going to ask, I know that we started this conversation about talking about public trust and stuff like that. And so for new nonprofits that are just starting out, how do they kind of gain that trust, and what are some areas they could also dig in for funding? Because you can't really do this work without enough funding. And it's
Right.
always difficult when you're starting out.
Yes, I mean, the best way to answer that is public trust is you have to look at what creates public distrust, right? And so the quality of your information, the quality of your data, the types of, articulate storytelling that you do, not just like I'm asking for money, but I'm telling you a story about a solution and what happened, right? An individual and what happened. So those authentic stories, those the way that you are measuring and articulating data and solution building, and your ability to show competence, right? Through your financials, through the reports that you make public. Those are some small ways that, smaller or newer nonprofits can do this, right? So think about what drives distrust and do the opposite of that thing, right? And so, on the slides, we really try to kind of give you some options and some opportunities for doing that with your organization.
All right. So without anything else, thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks,
and
everybody.
we will see you next time.